Welcome to our webcast, Engaging Stakeholders for Research Impact. I'm your host, Ann Outlaw, and this webcast is brought to you by the Center on Knowledge Translation for Disability and Rehabilitation Research, and we're funded by the National Institute for Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. Today, we'll be hearing from Tamika Hayden and Tony Saya about stakeholder engagement in disability research. We'll hear about its importance and how to authentically integrate end users into research projects. Tamika Hayden is the principal of Knowledge Translation Australia, and she has more of a decade of career experience as a researcher and research manager in the fields of health, sport, and medical research that began with a sports science degree and a PhD in biomechanics. Tamika's national and international work brings together researchers and research users to share, create, and translate knowledge for the betterment of society. Tony Saya identifies as a disabled woman with a deep commitment to social justice, inclusion, and equity for all. Her research interests include disability culture and disability identity in relation to the intersectionality and diversity in higher education. Soon, in the fall of 2021, Tony will begin a new position as an assistant professor at San Diego State University. And we're also fortunate enough to have Tony serve on our expert review panel at KTDRR. Today's webcast is a complement to a recently released information brief, which was produced by Drs. Hayden and Saya of the same title. You can find this info brief along with other presentation materials on our website at ktdrr.org. Well, let's go ahead and just dive right in. So, stakeholder engagement. Tamika, I'll start with you. How would you define stakeholder engagement? And secondly, why is it important?
Great questions, and lots of people think about these things really differently. So stakeholder engagement, from my perspective, is about working together with stakeholders. It's about having a common goal. And engaging stakeholders requires really to have an iterative process. It's not just one way, it's actually engagement. So it's got to be back and forth. It requires a lot of knowledge sharing. And there has to be the creation of a really shared understanding and how that engagement is going to help to make things more relevant or to help people with effective decisions. So from my mind, the real key thing here is the word is engagement, not dissemination or communication. So it's two-way. I think it's important for a number of reasons when we're talking about research in particular. It helps us to create questions that are going to be much more relevant and tangible to solve problems. It's going to provide a lot of new perspectives as well, because when you have those conversations where you're listening to your stakeholders, you realize what it is that's really important to them, what's needed, not just what you think is needed. So we can understand those needs. We can help to come up with solutions to those, which is what the ultimate goal of most research is. And also it helps us to overcome this wants versus needs issue. I often talk about the difference between what we want and what we need. And the way that I position that is to say that we all think everyone needs to do something or needs to change something, but what do they want to do? People won't make that change or do anything different unless they really want to do it. So you have to kind of identify the difference between what you think someone needs to do and what they're ready and willing and want to do or want to change or want to see happen. The other thing that's really interesting here is there is a piece of work that showed that ultimately the likelihood of someone using research evidence is based more on the strength of your relationship with that person than on the strength of the evidence that you're giving them. Scary as that may be, I think that really highlights relationships as being absolute key, absolute vital, which is why, really looping back to engaging with people to develop those relationships is the number one piece.
Relationships are key, and building those relationships is something I'd like to talk to a little bit more along the way. But Tony, I'd like to pass the baton over to you. Can you tell us what your idea of stakeholder engagement is and why you think it's important?
So I want to preface whatever I have to say with the fact that I identify as a disabled woman and a wheelchair user. And so for me, stakeholder engagement is very tied to representation. Because if we're not represented at the table, we're on the menu. And I think that that's really important. And I think so in this case, and specific to my community, right? It's stakeholder engagement is about involving the disability community in decisions that that could potentially impact their lives. Um, but I also think it's a way to get at equity, because if we involve different people in the process, it moves away from just a disability issue and everybody has a stake in the game, which, and I think is very tied to kind of what Tamika said, right? If you help people figure out how it relates to them, they're likely to engage and they're likely to commit. And I think that that's really important. And tied to research, oftentimes disabled people are researched but they're not involved in the process, or we don't end up researching things that actually would benefit the community. And this to me is the importance of the stakeholder engagement, getting multiple perspectives at the table. And that really helps with buy-in, because if you have multiple people coming to the table, that's how we could get to change. And because we could all see what we can do to get to this overall goal. So for me, it's very tied to representation and really, again, making our research applicable to the world and more real life. Because I think that's something that's missing from research is that tangible piece. I know the importance of data, but we forget that a lot of times we're researching people. So how do we bridge that gap and make it usable and really make sure that people feel heard and supported?
Definitely. Thank you, Tony. Tamika, I'd like to pass it back over to you. So when you are working with researchers or doing research yourself, when do you involve stakeholders and what does that involvement look like?
Yeah, great point. And I think I just want to pick up on something that Tony said that I think is really important as well. And it's kind of really highlighting the fact that we can't research and do things to people. It's not just for people either, it's with people. And I think that's kind of the key thing is we sort of say, don't do it to people, do it for people. But I think with people is where we're really having this conversation about stakeholder engagement. So I wanted to just kind of raise that. But in terms of when to involve people, look, it depends on the type of work that you're doing. So if you're in a really fundamental research space, you're probably not going to have the same type of stakeholders right up front. You would probably speak to some consumers, definitely people with lived experience, even if you're researching in kind of really biological mechanisms underlying some sort of diseases. But ultimately, in terms of really getting stakeholder involvement, it's much more along the applied end. Generally speaking, it's not to say it's not important at all levels, but it is much more important when you're getting to that applied level, because if you're providing solutions that are going to be realized through your work, you need to make sure that you have those inputs early. So what we know is that most successful solutions or most successful knowledge that comes out of research is generated when the stakeholders are involved right from the very beginning of that process. So they need to be involved along the entire research continuum during the development of questions, while people are thinking about what's relevant to do research on, making decisions around what the questions will be or answer. So during that project development stage, making sure there's the co-production of those questions, working out what's relevant, what's timely, what's important right now, and again, going back to what's wanted by the particular stakeholder groups that are relevant to your work. And also then throughout the project. So you can't just have that conversation at the beginning, run off and say, thank you for your input, we'll see you in 4 years when we finish the project, although that does happen more often than we want. But then it's about how do you involve people along the way? So during the process, how can you take those stakeholders and help them to continue to guide, to have that buy-in throughout the process, to provide feedback regularly to make sure that you haven't gotten off track, or even just to know what's new in their world versus your world as a researcher, and to serve as an advisor almost, to be very inclusive and part of that process. So all the way throughout. Then there's the process at the end of that research, where you need those stakeholders who may be the ones who are going to help to disseminate it, to implement it, to be the voice for change and championing the information for you. So that would be one of the roles, and there's many different ways that stakeholders can be involved throughout the process. That could be one of them. So asking them, how should we shape those messages? What is it that people need to hear? What's the format for how we deliver this information? So there's lots of different stages along the way. You can have different stakeholders at different stages. It doesn't matter if you maybe missed a group of particular stakeholders at the beginning and partway through you realize we need to know some information from these guys. Go find it out. It's never too late. But I think really inclusivity along the entire pathway is absolutely vital if you are going to say that you are genuinely engaging your stakeholders.
Definitely. That's a great take on when you involve stakeholders with your research project. And it sounds a lot like integrated knowledge translation, right? And the ways to collaborate consistently throughout the research process. In your work, Tamika, this seems like it takes a lot of investment and time. How can research projects that you've worked with plan for that investment?
Yeah, it's a great question. And people do say it's almost like you need funding in advance of setting up the research question in order to do that work, to build those relationships with those stakeholders. I guess my answer to that and to it is something that comes up quite a lot. It's it takes too much work, it takes too much time, it costs too much money, we don't get funded to do that, I don't get rewarded to do that. What I will say is a couple of things on that. And one is, if you are a lifetime researcher, or if you are doing research because you want to do meaningful things, it's not an add-on. It is a necessity. It's a way of working. It's a status quo for how we operate as a researcher. So don't think about it as an add-on. Secondly, if this is something that you're genuine about, you're building relationships and connections to research, to stakeholders who are relevant to your research topics and to what you work on all of your career. So it's not like you need to go out and build a brand new relationship with every single person every single time you have an idea for a research project. So this is where you start to build up that network and have those continued relationships and connections that you can call on, and they can usually connect you to others, or they might be part of the people that you need. But having that network and building that up so that you don't have to spend so much time doing it each time, and keeping those connections. So you have to nurture them. It can't just be every now and again we reach out because we want something. Everyone's got one of those friends who gets in touch every time you just want something from somebody. So really thinking about how do you nurture those relationships a bit better and keep them maintained if that's your area of work. So they're the things that I say to people who think that it's costs a lot of money, or it's too resource intensive, or it takes too much time. The other thing I will say is, if your research is meaningful to other people and it's going to have a chance of being used in society or more broadly, then you're going to have an impact. And what we know in many countries now, they are measuring the impact of researchers. So you will be assessed on the impact that you've had. That impact that you've had will mean a lot of different things. It will affect your ability to be promoted for within your organization. It'll affect your ability to win funding and get more grant money to do more research. So working with people will help you do really relevant research. It'll help you ultimately create information that's going to be used, which means you'll have an impact, which circles back and helps your career and helps you get more funding to help more people and to keep doing this type of work. So ultimately, you just have to build that network, make sure that you are working in this way, because it's got so many more benefits than it does, negatives, really.
Definitely. Thank you
Just
for
jump
that.
in real quick on an idea that I think is really important to one of Tamika's earlier points about engaging stakeholders. I think it's twofold. I think it's really important to engage them early on, but then if you're going to bring them to the table, that involves a listening. Because people, if you want to truly engage people, you have to respect people's opinions and approaches coming to the table. And if you're doing true stakeholder engagement, I mean, it's pretty obvious that people are going to come with unique lenses, with things that are their niche that they might be considering more than others. And I think that to really do great stakeholder engagement from start to finish, it means that you have to be listening, even if that changes the plan. And I know sometimes researchers are they have an outline and they want to stick to it. And I get that as a researcher, but I think, that's tied to the relationships as well. Because if stakeholders are coming to the table and they don't feel heard, then what is the likelihood they want to engage in a future project? If they gave their time and energy, and most of the time their passion, right? They're coming to the table because they care about this. And you've also invited them and then they don't feel heard. So I think it's really important to have a structure where stakeholders feel like they could give feedback and they could be part of the process. It's not enough. This is not a checklist. Like if you get 25 stakeholders in the room, you're doing a better job because they're in the room. This is about quality over quantity and really people having a voice at the table. And of course, that voice may look different throughout the process of who's speaking or who's in the decision-making process. But I think baseline, we have to make sure that if we're going to engage these folks, that we're willing to listen, we're willing to adjust, and we're willing to recognize that we're in this together. This is not a hierarchical approach. This is, we want to move together and work together towards the overall goal. And I think that that's really something to keep in mind, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions. Like if we just bring 50 people in the room, then we're doing this. And then we could talk about how many people we've brought in, but I wouldn't say we necessarily engage those folks. And so I just want to point out the real importance of what we're talking about is engaging these folks, not just inviting them. Because you have to be willing to listen. Nobody wants to go to a party whenever they speak up and nobody listens, right? You wouldn't go back to that party because you don't feel heard. So stakeholders are not going to email you back when you reach out for a future project or help with the dissemination or any of the future goals. So it's really important to think about how we make sure stakeholders feel heard.
Mhm. Great point, Tony. Yeah, nurturing those relationships, and there's a reciprocity of those relationships as well. You can't just take and expect them to give for the lifetime of a career if you're working in one area of study. So,
I don't know about for Tamika, but real quick, I wanted to bring up, once you begin nurturing these relationships, it ends up being mutually beneficial if it's a true relationship, because then you're being called on proactively as well for other projects. And we know that the more proactive we are, instead of trying to fix things retroactively, the better the quality of what we produce is. So it's really important to think about the nurturing as mutually beneficial.
That's a great point, Tony. And you've just reminded me of something as well, is that we can tend to look at somebody and sort of, or maybe have an initial couple of words or be introduced to somebody. And if we're in that mind space where we're thinking, oh, I might be networking, or I might be really just interested in meeting people who serve my needs right now, as a researcher. So I always say to researchers, when you are going in to engage with people, you're going in with a draft. Your ideas are literally draft to be pulled apart, discussed, reframed. But one of the other things I'll say is that I've often been in situations where people are networking and you get introduced and they kind of hear where you're from or what you do, and then suddenly it's like, not interested anymore. And it's really off-putting. One of the best connections I ever made was purely unexpected, and it's made me really realize that it's those unexpected connections. So I think this links back to what you're saying about value all of those connections, because you don't know when they're going to be valuable. I met a woman on a plane, and to this day I call her my fairy godmother. She was just this elderly lady who happened to be sitting next to where I was going to sit. I think it was kind of fate. I had changed my spot where I was going to sit and ended up sitting next to her. And it was at this time where I was working in knowledge translation. No one knew what on earth that was here in Australia. And I sit down next to her, and I've been at this conference where people have been asking me, what is this thing, translation? Actually, a science communication conference I'd been at. And the first thing she says to me is, what do you do, dear? And I thought, oh, here we go. And I said to her, well, and I thought, because I just thought she's not going to get this, she's not going to understand. But anyway, and I said, oh, well, I work with researchers and scientists to make sure their research gets used in the world. And she turns to me and she says, oh, dear, you're a translator. And then she goes on to say, I used to be a scientist, and now I'm a philanthropist. How can I help you? Mm-hmm. And to this day, she's been one of the best connections I've ever made. And we spent an entire flight, I think it was a 4 or 5 hour flight, talking and mapping out lots of different plans that we had. And then when we arrived back into my hometown in Perth, which it was at that time, for days, she emailed and rang me and saying, I've set up a meeting with this person. I've set up a meeting with this person. I've connected you to this person. I was getting in the door with people I didn't even think I would ever get in the door with. So never underestimate the person that's in front of you that you think might not be relevant to what you're talking about.
I love that story, Tamika. It's, if we could all have such a great fairy godmother. and valuing, going back to the point of just valuing who you're with and seeing that everybody has something that either you can help with or they can help with, and it's just about relationship building.
Yeah, and being open to the relationship.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, Tamika. Yeah, I mean, I agree, but also sometimes that approach helps you realize who's missing from the table. Because sometimes when you're doing this and it becomes routine and you're very good at stakeholder engagement, we get comfortable. We lean on the supports that we know already exist and the relationships, which I know I just said are very important to nurture. But sometimes those informal connections really help you recognize, okay, what am I missing? Who can I be connecting to? Or what do we need to do differently this time? And I think that's sometimes a lot easier said than done. And sometimes it does take, an outsider to be like, have you thought about this? Because let's not kid ourselves. People doing this work, we're passionate about what we research. So we have, one lens, right? And yes, we could be good at exploring different lenses, but of course we're going to come to the table with whatever, our ideas are, or how our ideas are framed. So sometimes it's really important to think about who's missing and how can we elevate this project? Because there's a difference between good stakeholder engagement and excellent stakeholder engagement and effective stakeholder engagement. We're not aiming for just connect these folks and just let's listen to them and maybe it'll help, right? This is a continuum. And I think as many times as you could kind of check yourself, that's when your project kind of elevates, at least in my experience.
That brings me to another question, which is to either one of you. Have you had situations where you've had to listen but then not act on a stakeholder suggestion?
In thinking about it, I guess I've had, to be really honest and frank, I've even had moments myself where I've had to check my own response to someone and my own becoming defensive with somebody, and reflect on that. And so I guess the only thing that I can really think is to say, often when you're having these conversations, it's not about coming up with a solution or an answer in that room in that time. It's actually about putting all of the thoughts on the table and then going away and reflecting on those and giving it some time. One of the strategies I now use is to say, when somebody says something that I don't agree with or I don't like, or that kind of makes me feel a bit defensive in some way, then I have to just let that simmer. Don't respond straight away. Walk around the block a couple of times. Give it some time, because usually what happens is that over that time, you settle down and you go from that first defensive thinking to, you know what, they're right. Or, okay, I don't agree with it, but I can see where they're coming from, or I can appreciate that we actually have different views on this, rather than the very first reaction. So I think sometimes it's about letting everything get put on the table and then taking the time to actually absorb it. So maybe the key from my side would be, don't go into these types of engagements or conversations and expect to have an answer right there and then. Give people time to reflect on both sides, on all sides.
Definitely. Tony, do you have
I
something
mean,
to add?
I totally agree with all of that. I also think that's where flexibility comes in for me. I think it's really important that we move away from such rigid thinking. Again, and we have to consider maybe why somebody is saying that. But tied to the flexibility, I mean, when I've truly engaged in this, I think it's really important in the beginning to really outline how you see us all working together. So it sets the stage for people to understand their role in the relationship, because from my experience, not every stakeholder has an identical role or an identical stake in the game. So if you set the stage up outright, I think it prepares people. I think it also primes people to know when they should fight tooth and nail for their belief versus take it as a compromise. Or like, so for example, if you invite me in as a disabled person because you want the disabled perspective, then I'm going to give that, right? But if if I'm at the table, for maybe a different reason, for my research expertise, and then my disability is just an added aspect, I may think about compromising in some of the things, right? You have to know kind of, I don't want to say you have to know your place, but in the professional world, you kind of have to know, I like to say you have to know when to drip the faucet, right? So some people you're going to have a strong, you're going to put it full stream, and then some people you're going to drip that. And I think it's tied to the earlier point of like knowing how to talk to different people and meeting them where they're at. I think it's really dependent on how you're dripping that faucet. If you're going full stream and if you're just dripping it here and there, right? So if I'm entering a place where they don't know a thing about disability, the way I approach that is going to be different than if I enter a disability rights organization to engage in research, right? It's going to be different. And I think that acknowledging that, and I think, and this might sound a little bit cliche or maybe obvious, but I think you have to spend time getting to know each other, like a little bit, maybe not all the time, like icebreakers or different things, but I think it sometimes helps to really get to know the people separate from whatever you're working on. So having like 5 to 10 minutes to just chat with each other, separate than the overall goal, or learning facts about each other that are just like fun facts, sometimes really helps people to kind of lighten the mood. But I don't want to ignore the fact that, of course, serious decisions have to be made. But I think if you create a culture from the beginning of compromise and a strength-based approach, we're all going to have strengths and we're all going to have weaknesses. I think that sets the stage for people to be prepared for that. That you know, you're not going to get everything you want. And I think it ties back to a lot of what Tamika said at the beginning, the difference between what do we need as a group and what do we want. Because I think, and that it changes. And it could even change meeting to meeting. Sometimes you meet somebody on a Tuesday, you're all in sync, you're like, okay. And then on Wednesday, somebody's like, have we thought about X? And you got to go right back to the drawing board. And I think, I don't know, I'm a big fan of priming people for what to expect. And of course, with the caveat of there's going to be there's going to be a need for flexibility, and it's not always going to go according to plan.
All right. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the info brief that you two wrote. We're very excited to share it with our audience who are, of course, NIDLR grantees, but as well as others in the research sphere and elsewhere. So, Tony, I'd like to ask you this question. While the intended audience for the brief is the grantees that we work with at KTDRR, who else do you think should read this?
So I'm going to go out on a limb and say this needs to be widely disseminated to everybody. I think while this is very research focused, I think this is a very great example. Actually, from start to finish, even creating the info brief, Tamika and I are two very different professionals that probably wouldn't cross paths, but yet I think we created a very great info brief. And I think it starts with how it's created. And I think to me, when I read that info brief, I feel a sense of inclusion. And I'm talking about inclusion broadly. I think it highlights the benefits of having different people at the table. So I think that whether of course, this is a lens of research or stakeholder engagement, but I think this approach could go broadly. I think that this could be useful for people teaching, people working in the community, because, while we were very specific in our examples, I still think that this approach could be adapted to whatever environment you're working for. And I think, again, this info brief gets you thinking in whatever you do, in whatever work you do. Who should I be talking to? Who's missing from the conversation? And I think that that's an important question to think about no matter who you are. And no matter what stage of your career you're in. I think it's really important. I mean, I would love to see everyday people that are engaging in research that maybe are not part of a larger grants read some of this, because I still think that this is, again, I think that this is important across fields. I think, again, it could be adapted and useful to almost anybody that's engaging in anything that is with the community.
Mm-hmm.
I know that that's pretty broad, but I'd like to see it widely disseminated.
I'm so happy to hear that was your experience in writing it. That, of course, inclusivity is something we strive for, but, it's hard to hit that mark. So, Tamika, what are your thoughts on the question about who do you think should be the audience for this info brief?
Yeah, look, I agree completely with what Tony has said, and she's absolutely right. We came together to put this together from really different worlds and views, and I think that really speaks to what we're saying about engagement and that inclusivity. I agree completely that it's really for anyone who wants to understand what engagement really is, and B, who does engagement in their job, their role, their life, anything that they do across the board. One of my favorite things about how all of this came together was that it wasn't purely an academic thing where we just sort of told people what the literature says about engagement. It brought in those perspectives from Tony's side on what what it really is from a different perspective, and from that case study kind of example, which I think gives this particular document incredible power and incredible relevance, because that's what it's all about. It's about, making sure that that the message is not just a clear, this is what we know works, but considerations from reality as well.
Tony, would you mind sharing with our listeners what Tamika is speaking about, the example that you provided in the brief?
So in the stakeholder brief, we highlighted an example where we worked with a local existing restaurant to improve accessibility, because there were some accessibility concerns, and we really worked with a variety of different people in the community, so stakeholders at all different levels, to achieve this overall goal. And in this case, of course, the main goal was increased access, but that included different people across the board, and that researchers needed to be involved. People that do audits, different people needed to be involved in the process to get it to where it was, and for it to be successful. And I want to point out the reason that we chose this example is, yes, this could have probably been done with one or two people, but we elevated the project and included people from all different stakes of the game to really look at widespread change, to really look to see this project as an example that can be used for future areas to improve access. So I think that this example specifically highlights the benefits of getting unique perspectives, and it allowed us to figure out approaches that worked.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing it. It's a fascinating piece of the info brief for me to see really how stakeholder engagement can work, and when it can work well with measurable results. How do you see stakeholder engagement being measured in the field, or is it?
That's a really interesting question. And I think what we have to consider is that, firstly, measured can be an ugly word. I know I used it before. I have to be careful because it's something that we slip into. So in the impact realm, we talk about assessing rather than measuring, because not everything can be measured. But if we assess those stakeholder relationships, and there are tools out there that help us to go through and evaluate the stakeholder engagement or the stakeholder relationships, and they can be really great tools to use, and they are mentioned as part of the info brief as well. So there's a number of different scales where you rate how things are working within the relationship and how things kind of ended up. And each of the parties involved will go through and rank those elements. And you can do that throughout the process. You can do it, in the middle, and then along the lines a little bit, and then at the end to see how you're tracking or what elements need to improve. So you can assess those relationships and see how they're working. I think the other way that we can assess stakeholder engagement, which is a little more distal from sort of the relationship piece, is did you deliver something that was able to be adopted or adapted into use by that stakeholder? And if you did, and if that happened, then that is really a measure, if you like, or an indication of the impact or the value of the work that you've had. If you work all this time with a group of stakeholders and at the end they say no, you need to, I guess, ask yourself and assess, is that reason no because something else changed? Or is it that I didn't listen and I didn't get it right? Or maybe we did the research and found that what we looked at wasn't going to work, which is fine. But ultimately, we can use those measures of impact and use of that work or adoption of that work in some way as a way of working out whether or not the relationship was effective. Because again, it ties back. If you have that trust, if you've built the relationship, if you've listened to what people want and you're providing a solution that's meaningful, ultimately you would expect, if you find what you hope to find through your research, that it would be put into practice in some way or adopted in some way.
Excellent. Thank you, Tamika. Um, I think I'll do final question here. Uh, I'm interested in bringing in a diverse set of people as we are looking for feedback into either designing our research question or, all through the integrated KT process here. Do you have suggestions or ideas on how to cultivate really diverse and inclusive stakeholders?
For me, I think it's all about how you market. And I think if you want a specific community or representation, you have to make sure that you're marketing and you're welcoming to that community. And you have to find a way to immerse yourself in that. The first time you connect with that community shouldn't be when you need them to be a stakeholder. You need to think proactively in what you need. And this is true for stakeholder engagement and everything you do in life, because people know when you're just seeking them out because they fit this cookie cutter representation of what we think we need. This is true. I hear this all the time. It's like, well, we want to hire disabled folks. It's like, well, did you market to disabled folks, or were you just like hoping they would show up? How do they know that they would even be taken seriously as candidates? And also thinking about your research and if that research is welcoming to that perspective. Because if it's not, then that might not be the greatest time to try to include all these people. Because I think there is something as this kind of forced inclusion. And that's what I want to move away from. So I think to get away from that feeling of forced inclusion, you really have to be doing your homework ahead of time and fostering some of those relationships within the community prior to when you actually want to run the research or the project or work on the goal. So in the example in the stakeholder brief, where we all work together to increase access, we were involving people in the disability community that had been working on access for several years. We already had a relationship with them. We didn't just call on them once we had this barrier, right? We worked with people that were doing this work and treated them as experts. We really used our network. So I think it's really important to be intentional. And how that starts is you have to make sure that the practices and whatever you're doing considers not only inclusion, but equity. Because if you want people to keep coming back and to be a part of it, there needs to be equity. So just a real quick example, a lot of people tell me, oh yeah, the place is accessible. There's a ramp, right? Because I am a wheelchair user. Yes, a ramp might bring me into the space, but once I get into the space, can I participate like everybody else? Do I have an equitable representation at that table? Or do I have to do things differently? And I hope that answers your question, but I guess what I want to highlight is it's not something that happens overnight. This is a process that you have to really look within of how you're maybe unintentionally not including folks because of maybe some of your processes.
Great points, Tony. Tamika, do you have something to share about equity, diversity, and bringing folks with different voices to the table?
Look, I think I mean, I love Tony's response, and I think, absolutely, it, even in just hearing what you mentioned there, it really brings a lot of things to my mind and a lot of considerations or assumptions that we can make, right? So like you said, having the ramp to get into the building is one tiny element of it all. And I think all too often we do tend to just tick boxes like that and think about just like the simple things rather than everything. And I think it takes a lot more. So I don't really have anything to add in terms of from that side of the equity and inclusion. I guess what I would say is that if you want people to be included, You have to, and it speaks back to when you sort of say about marketing to the right people as well. It's got to be something that's wanted by people to get their attention. Again, that lens of we think people need this. So you might have to, even before you get those people in the door, go and talk to a smaller group or one or two of your close connections that are in that space to say, how can we, what would attract the right people to do this? And there's a whole bunch of tools as well that you can use that, getting back into the kind of the academic realm, there's a lot of tools that you can use that will help you to kind of think and that provide like really great lists of potential stakeholder types. But the best thing you can do is talk to the connections you already have, talk to more connections that they have. Brainstorming is your friend, because really you just have to sit down and go, who might this be important to or valuable to, or who do I need to hear from? What voices do I need in order to develop the best thing that I'm doing? And it really can be just talking to people. So that scares a lot of researchers who aren't kind of so social, but ultimately be open to it, have those conversations and listen to what people are saying. So you can start to go, oh, I never thought about including this group, or, oh, we've neglected to include this other group. So, it's never too late. Go have those conversations. And like Tony said, you do have to have the existing relationships. So talk to people. Don't turn up to meet someone that you've never met before with an agenda. Just turn up purely to say, hi, let's have a coffee, let's have a chat, let's talk about what's going on, and get permission to actually to broach the subject of what it is that you need or that you want in your work, but only after you've formed a relationship with that person. You don't turn up on someone's door and knock on it and go, hey, I noticed that you're in the 60 to 65 year bracket and I need someone for my research in that bracket. It just wouldn't work. So I think build the relationship first, and then listen to those connections, because they'll have other ideas, and meet up with people who really are different from you, because they're going to have different thinking and they're going to come up with different strategies for different things and different groups, and that'll open up your thinking and help you to make sure that everyone's included, or make sure that you've thought about who should be involved.
Thank you very much, Tamika and Tony, for having this conversation with us today. And thank you to all of our listeners. Like I said earlier, the information brief that Tamika and Tony authored is on our website, along with other presentation materials. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at ktdrr@air.org. You can also pose your questions in our online evaluation form, and everyone who registered for this webcast will receive an email with this evaluation link. So please take a few minutes and let us know what you thought about this webcast. And this format is new, and we'd love to hear your thoughts about it. And finally, thank you to NIDLR for providing funding for this webcast and all of KTDRR's events. Thank you.